They say history forgets women like Anne Boleyn. They say her name is just a warning carved into stone, the wife who flew too close to power and lost her head for it. But they're wrong. Somewhere inside the Tower of London, beneath centuries of dust and silence, lies a single letter that survived everything. A letter written not to save a queen, but to save a child. And when you hear what it said, you'll realize Anne Boleyn's final act wasn't her execution. It was love. It's the 2nd of May, 1536. The air at Greenwich Palace trembles with the sound of a tennis ball hitting the court sharp, rhythmic, ordinary. But history never begins with noise. It begins with footsteps. They echo down the corridor, cutting through laughter. The Queen turns, sees her ladies-in-waiting freeze, and then she sees him a messenger, breathless. Pal, your Majesty. He stammers. The King's Privy Council requests your immediate presence. Anne Boleyn lays down her racket for a heartbeat, but she doesn't move. Her face stays calm, practiced, unreadable, but her pulse betrays her. She knows this isn't about the game anymore. When she steps into the hallway, 3 men are waiting. One of them is her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. The same man who once toasted her coronation now cannot even meet her eyes. His voice is cold. Official, you are commanded to surrender yourself to the Tower. The charge is adultery. In Henry's England, adultery isn't just a sin. It's treason. And treason means death. But the cruelest part is still to come. Anne doesn't yet know that her own blood, her uncle, has built the trap around her. Norfolk is a survivor. He's kept his head through decades of royal madness by obeying one rule: the king's favor comes before family. He's already planning to replace Anne with another niece, a younger one, Catherine Howard. He thinks sacrificing one will secure the other. He doesn't yet realize that Henry will kill Catherine. 2. For now, the Queen of England is stripped of her crown, her freedom, her dignity. She's placed on a barge and rowed down the Thames toward the Tower. The last time she saw those gray walls, bells rang for her coronation. This time, the same walls wait for her death. Inside, Sir William Kingston greets her, the same man who once oversaw her triumph. 3 years earlier, he had arranged her chambers for celebration. Now he locks the same doors. Anne glances around, recognizing every stone. The echo of music seems to haunt the air. She remembers walking here in cloth of gold and laughter. Now, she walks in silence, escorted by guards who will not meet her gaze. Kingston observes her carefully. In his journal, he will later write, "She is still sharp, still composed, still the queen." But her words often return to the Lady Elizabeth over and over. Anne asks, "Where is my daughter? Is she safe? Does she know what's happening?" She fears not the scaffold. She fears the future her child will inherit, the coldness of a father's court, the weight of a forbidden name. Within these walls, she begins to understand the shape of her end. There will be no pardon, no justice, no mercy, yet she refuses to let silence write her last chapter. If she cannot change her fate, she will define it. That night, she requests writing materials, paper, ink, Kill. Kingston hesitates. What if she writes to foreign allies? What if she sends secrets beyond the tower? But a queen, even a condemned one, still carries a trace of power. He allows it, and as the candle burns low, Anne Boleyn bends over the parchment. Every stroke of her pen is deliberate, every word a heartbeat. She isn't writing to beg, she's writing to remember. She's writing to leave behind something that Henry cannot destroy, the truth of who she was and the daughter she will never hold again. And that's where our story begins. Because in the next part, we'll open that letter, the one Henry never read, and step inside the mind of a woman who loved harder than a king could ever understand. Stay with me. Sit back, breathe, and let the candlelight of history flicker for a little longer. The night is long. The tower is cold. And Anne's voice is about to speak again across 500 years of silence. The tower does not sleep. Its stones carry whispers of prayers and screams, of oaths once sworn and later broken within its walls. The air hangs heavy, as if time itself slows to watch those trapped inside. When Anne Boleyn entered through the Traitor's Gate, she was not merely a queen fallen from grace. She was a story being rewritten before her eyes. The same walls that had once echoed her laughter now listened to the slow unraveling of her courage. In the first hours of her imprisonment, the weight of betrayal pressed upon her shoulders like invisible armor. She had been Henry's obsession, the woman for whom he had defied Rome, shattered a faith, and remade a nation. Now, that same devotion had turned to disgust, as though love itself had become treason. The courtiers whispered that the king avoided saying her name, that he spoke instead of the concubine. They said he rode daily with Jane Seymour, smiling again, as if his conscience had never known the name Anne. The tower's rooms were silent, except for the shuffle of guards. Her ladies faithful once, frightened, now avoided her gaze. They still curtsied when she entered, still called her Your Majesty. But the words were fragile, spoken like glass that could crack with one wrong syllable. Anne knew this silence. It was the same kind that crept through the court before every fall. The stillness before executioners were summoned. She asked for no food. Instead, she requested paper, ink, and a candle. Kingston, watching her, felt a kind of pity he did not expect. He remembered her coronation, the music, the river filled with lanterns, the smell of roses drifting from her barge. He had seen kings rise and die, but never a queen who carried both defiance and grace so completely. Yet now, she seemed smaller, her strength folded inward like a flame protected from the wind. Anne's thoughts turned constantly to Elizabeth. Each hour passed like a slow heartbeat, each heartbeat whispering the same name. My child, my Elizabeth. It was not the thought of death that frightened her. It was the thought of absence. Death was an end. Absence was eternity, somewhere beyond the tower. Her daughter was being carried through the corridors of Hatfield House, watched by nurses who did not speak her mother's name. Would she remember the voice that sang to her at night? Would she know the scent of jasmine and ink that always clung to Anne's hands? Anne tried to pray, but found the words hollow. God felt distant, not cruel, but unreachable. The saints on the painted walls stared down with pity that felt too much like judgment. Her faith had once been her weapon, the foundation of her certainty. Now it trembled. She wondered if perhaps God himself had turned his face away, tired of the noise of kings and queens who used his name to justify their desires. Cromwell's agents came daily. Polite as spiders, they asked questions laced with lies. They wanted names. Men she had supposedly loved. Men she had supposedly betrayed the king with. Each denial she gave seemed to feed their conviction. Her words were no longer truth. They were evidence of defiance. When she refused to cry, they called her cold. When she smiled faintly, they called her mad. Every gesture, every breath was twisted into guilt. At night, she sat by the narrow window and listened to the city across the river. London went on, living bells ringing, carts rattling, dogs barking, a world indifferent to her suffering. She thought of the people who once cheered her name, the crowds that had hailed her as the dawn of a new England. Where were they now? Did they sleep easily while their queen awaited death but beneath the despair? Something else began to grow, a strange clarity, a slow acceptance that the world she had built around herself was dissolving, and yet something truer was being revealed. All her life, Anne had been surrounded by ambition. Her father's, her uncle's, even Henry's. She had been used to build and to destroy. Now, stripped of court and crown, she finally belonged only to herself. The irony cut deep. She had to lose everything to find what was real. When Kingston brought her news that the men accused with her, her brother George, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton had all been condemned, she did not weep. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Then I shall see them soon." But later that night, when no one was watching, she pressed her hands to her mouth and shook silently until the candle burned out. In those hours, she began to write her letter. It was not an act of hope. It was an act of preservation. If Henry would not hear her voice, then perhaps history would. She began by addressing him as "Your Grace," the form of respect she had once spoken with devotion. The quill scratched across the paper like a whisper of defiance. Never prince had wife more loyal in all duty and in all true affection than you have found in Anne Boleyn. The sentence glowed in the candlelight, a final assertion of truth in a world that had twisted itself around her. She paused, staring at the ink, pooling at the edge of her pen, and thought of the years she had spent believing in Henry, the man who had written her letters in the language of poets, who had sworn eternal love, who had once promised her the world. That man was gone now, replaced by a figure of cold righteousness, a king desperate to erase his own guilt by making her the villain of his story. She did not curse him. She could not. Love and hatred had burned so long within her that they had become the same flame. She only wrote what needed to be remembered, that she had been faithful, that she had been wronged, and that Elizabeth was innocent of everything. When she signed her name, "Your most loyal and ever faithful wife," Anne Boleyn, her hand did not tremble. That single word, wife, was her victory. She would die as Henry's lawful queen, not as his discarded mistress. The church, the court, even history might try to call her otherwise. But the truth was written now in ink that even the king's fire could not erase. When the letter was sealed, she held it for a long time, tracing the edge of the parchment as if it were her daughter's face. Then she gave it to Kingston. He took it silently, knowing it might never reach its destination. He bowed, and for the first time, his voice broke. "Your Grace, I will see it safely kept." Anne only nodded. "It is not mine anymore," she said softly. "It belongs to the future." The next morning, the river was gray and swollen. London Bridge echoed with the cries of merchants, but within the tower, the world had narrowed to the rhythm of footsteps and the sound of hammers. Outside her window, the scaffold was being built plank by plank. She watched it rise with a calmness that frightened those around her. Death no longer seemed like an ending. It felt like a release. Her ladies wept quietly as they dressed her in a plain gown of dark velvet. She chose it herself. No jewels. No finery. "Let them see that a queen can die simply," she said. But when one of the women knelt and began to sob, Anne placed a hand on her shoulder. "Peace," she whispered. "You cry for me, but I go to meet my peace." That night, as rain began to fall over London, Anne sat awake, her back straight, her eyes open. The candle beside her guttered and went out. But she did not light another. She wanted darkness, the honest kind. The kind that does not pretend. Somewhere beyond those walls, Henry lay beside another woman, his conscience quieted by flattery and comfort. Yet in the tower, Anne's silence spoke louder than any prayer he might have mumbled in his sleep. When dawn came, the sky was pale, streaked with pink. The river moved sluggishly, heavy with rain. Anne looked toward it one last time and whispered, almost to herself, "Remember me when she laughs." No one answered. But Century-Letter, that laughter, Elizabeth's laughter, would echo through the halls of Whitehall. Across England, across history, the woman condemned for treason would become the mother of a queen who needed no king, and though Anne Boleyn could not know it, the letter lying unread in Cromwell's chest would one day rise from the dust to prove that love, even when silenced, leaves its trace in every future it touches. It was the 6th day of May, in the year 1536, when Anne Boleyn's hand closed around the quill for the final time outside the tower. The city still hummed, with indifferent life barges crossing the river, children shouting in the mud, the faint tolling of a church bell in the distance. But inside those cold walls, the world had already narrowed to parchment and ink. Her candle sputtered in the damp air, as if it, too, it were afraid of going out before the words were finished. The tower had grown darker since her arrival. Every night felt longer, the silence thicker, the presence of death more familiar. Anne's ladies moved like ghosts, speaking only when spoken to, their hands trembling as they poured her wine or brushed her hair. They could not meet her eyes, for they saw in them not madness or grief, but clarity. That was what frightened them most. Anne had stopped asking for news of the king. She no longer hoped for pardon. Hope was a luxury that belonged to the living, and she had already crossed into something quieter. Yet there remained one last thing she could control: her voice. it would not be drowned by the court's lies, or Cromwell's forged testimonies, or the king's silence. Her letter would speak when her body no longer could. She began with humility, the kind Henry demanded. "Your Grace's most humble and obedient wife submitteth herself unto your mercy." The words were carefully chosen, the tone deliberate. She knew his vanity better than anyone. To challenge him would be useless. To remind him of what he once loved might still plant a seed of doubt. She was no longer writing as a queen, but as a mirror reflecting back to Henry the image of his own cruelty, cloaked in the language of devotion. Between the lines, her heart broke in silence. She wrote of loyalty, of truth, of innocence. Yet every sentence trembled with a second meaning, the cry of a woman who had built her life around a man who now sought to erase her. She reminded him that her only crime was to give him a daughter. She begged not for her life, but for Elizabeth's name. Let not that unworthy stain of disloyalty fall upon your most dutiful wife and the infant princess. Your daughter, in that single phrase, Anne did what no one else dared. She bound her child's legitimacy to her own innocence. If she was guilty, Elizabeth was a bastard. If she was faithful, Elizabeth was born a rightful heir. Henry's decision would decide not only a woman's fate, but a dynasty's. And Anne, even condemned, it still played the long game of queens. When the ink dried, she read her words aloud, not to her ladies, but to the empty room, as if testing the air. The sound of her own voice startled her. It was softer now, but steadier than she expected. She sealed the letter with wax, pressing her ring into it one last time. Her hand lingered there, as though she could seal her entire life into that mark. Sir William Kingston entered quietly. He bowed, though his voice faltered when he spoke. "Your Majesty, is that the letter you wish to send?" Anne nodded. "Yes, to his grace. But it is not for him alone. It is for the truth." Kingston hesitated, understanding more than he was meant to. He promised to deliver it into Cromwell's hands that very night. When he left, Anne sat for a long time, staring at the door, as if she could still see the letter being carried away. She did not know that it would never leave the Tower. Thomas Cromwell received it before dawn. He read the first lines and stopped. His hand tightened on the parchment. To him, words were weapons. And this one cut too deeply. It spoke not as the plea of a dying woman, but as the conscience of a nation. It accused without accusation. It forgave without surrender. Cromwell saw what Henry might see if he read it, not treason, but truth. And truth was the one thing the king could not bear. He folded the letter, sealed it again, and locked it away among his private papers. The king must not see this, he told his clerk, his voice cold. Not now. Not ever. Perhaps he feared that Henry might hesitate. Perhaps he feared that pity might weaken the blade. Or perhaps, deep inside, Cromwell feared the power of a woman's words, the kind of power that does not command armies, but endures centuries. The letter disappeared into the shadows of his study. For 4 years, it would sleep there untouched, unread, hidden beneath the same ambition that destroyed its author. Back in the Tower, Anne felt the hours shrinking. She could hear the carpenters outside, building the platform where she would die. The sound did not frighten her. It was rhythm, wood on wood, a heartbeat marking time. When one of her ladies burst into tears, Anne only smiled faintly. "Do not weep for me," she said. "Weep for England, that it forgets so easily." That night, and she spoke softly to herself, as though reciting her own eulogy, never prince had wife more loyal, and yet no wife so betrayed. The words came out like a prayer. She thought of her wedding night, the soft flicker of candles, Henry's hand against hers, his voice promising her eternity. She thought of their daughter's first cry, the moment she believed her life's battles had been worth it. How strange, she mused, that the same man who had called her his salvation now called her his sin. Outside, the rain began again. It dripped from the eaves, a slow rhythm that matched her breath. She had been many things in her life: courtier, reformer, temptress, queen. But in that final solitude, she was something simpler, a mother writing her child into history. When the morning came, the guards brought word that her trial would be held within the week. The outcome was already known. Witnesses had been chosen, testimonies rehearsed. The verdict had been written before the trial began. Anne nodded, her face expressionless. Then there was nothing left to fear. But fear lingered anyway, not of death, but of being forgotten. She had seen how easily Henry erased his past. Catherine of Aragon's emblems had been torn down, her memory silenced. Would Anne suffer the same fate? Would her portraits burn? Her words vanish? Her daughter grow without even a name to cling to? She whispered, "If the world forgets me, let the world remember her." That sentence, carried only by the wind, would one day prove prophetic. Cromwell's silence was absolute. The letter never left his possession. When he was executed 4 years later, it was found, still sealed, among his belongings, its wax unbroken, its paper untouched. The king had never seen it. Henry's fury had burned out long before then. Replaced by regret, he would never confess. But by that time, the woman who might have forgiven him was long gone. Her ashes mingling with the cold earth beneath the Tower Chapel, and yet, Anne had already won something no crown could buy. Her words survived. The letter, hidden by the man who killed her, would outlive them both. Century later, scholars would hold that same parchment in trembling hands. The ink faded, the paper torn, but the voice unmistakable calm, clear, and proud. They would read her plea and wonder if perhaps Henry might have spared her had he seen it. But history does not deal in if, it deals in echoes. Anne's echo did not fade. It passed from ink to memory, from daughter to dynasty. The child she died to protect would grow to rule longer and stronger than any son Henry ever dreamed of. Elizabeth, the infant princess of the letter, would wear her mother's defiance like armor and her wisdom like a crown. And as she stood before her own court decades later, she would carry within her a silence older than her reign, the silence of a mother's final words. Sealed away, but never lost. The letter that Henry never read became the letter history could not ignore. It was more than a plea. It was Anne Boleyn's confession, prayer, and prophecy, all written on the same page. And though the king burned every trace of her name from his palaces, her words endured. She had written for love. History read it as rebellion. In the Tower, she had believed her story would end with death. Instead, it began there, the morning of the 15th day of May, 1536. Broke gray over the Tower. The air was wet with mist from the river, and a hush hung over London that felt unnatural, as if even the city itself were holding its breath. From the window of her chamber, Anne could see the faint silhouette of Westminster rising beyond the fog, the place where she had once been crowned, where bells had rung for her triumph. Now she would walk, not toward glory, but toward judgment. She dressed in silence. The gown was black damask, trimmed with crimson velvet, a queen's dignity wrapped in mourning. Her ladies, their eyes swollen from sleepless nights, tried to steady their hands as they tied her sleeves and smoothed her veil. Anne said nothing. There was no need. Each gesture was a farewell, every fold of fabric, a shroud already waiting for its moment. When the guards came for her, she did not resist. She lifted her chin, took one last look around the small chamber where she had written her letter, and whispered to herself, "Let truth speak. Even if I cannot." The great hall of the Tower had been transformed overnight into a theater of cruelty. Benches had been erected for peers and courtiers. Panas hung. The royal coat of arms, gleaming above the dais, a show of order, masking the machinery of execution. Nearly 2,000 spectators crowded into the space, their murmurs rippling through the cold air, like the low growl of a beast waiting to feed. At the far end sat her judges, 26 men of rank, each sworn to the king, each already aware of the verdict they were expected to deliver. Among them was her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presiding as Lord High Steward, his face carved in stone, his eyes avoiding hers. He, too, had once toasted her at banquets, calling her the jewel of our house. Now his lips were pressed thin, his voice ready to condemn. Anne was led to the bar, a slender figure in black, and curtsied with a grace that silenced even her enemies for a moment. Her composure unsettled them. She looked not like a guilty woman, but like someone attending her own coronation again. Calm, radiant in sorrow. The charges were read: adultery, incest, conspiracy to kill the king, each accusation heavier than the last. Each name of a supposed lover spat into the air like poison. Mark Smeaton. Musician, Henry Norris. Courtier, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and her own brother, George Boleyn. Viscount Rochford. Anne listened without flinching. When they finished, she lifted her head and spoke in a voice clear enough to cut through the hall's murmur. "My lords, I do not say these men are guiltless for their own sakes, but for mine, I believe they are innocent as I am. And I am as innocent as they." Her words were steady, her tone free of pleading. She had long ceased to believe in mercy. This was not a defense. It was a statement for the record, a message to the future. Cromwell sat among the spectators, his expression unreadable. His power filled the room like smoke. He had orchestrated every word spoken that day. Each witness rehearsed, each outcome sealed. He watched Anne the way a builder watches a tower collapse, not with pity, but with grim fascination. The witnesses stepped forward one by one. Their voices were thin, nervous, contradicting each other at every turn. The evidence was hollow rumors, innuendo, court gossip reshaped into royal truth. One man claimed she had smiled too warmly at him. Another that she had dropped her handkerchief in jest. The absurdity of it almost drew laughter. But non dared. When they accused her of plotting the king's death, she finally allowed herself a faint, incredulous smile. "Do you think me so foolish," she said, "that I would ruin my own head to gain another's crown?" Her voice trembled not with fear, but with irony, the terrible awareness that logic had no place here. Her brother was tried separately in the same hall that afternoon. From her cell, Anne could hear the muffled echoes of his defense, the scrape of benches, the crowd's murmur, the crash of a gavel. She could not see him, but she knew the sound of his voice when it rose once, proud and defiant. "I am condemned without proof," he said. Then, after a pause, softer, "May God forgive them all." When word came that George had been found guilty, Anne bowed her head. The guards thought she was praying, but she was remembering the two of them as children in Hever Castle, chasing fireflies by the moat, their father's ambition shaping their futures before they were old enough to understand the cost. She whispered, "We were born to serve a king. We should have remembered what that meant." That night, alone again, she sat by the candle and traced the outline of her letter on the table, her fingers remembering every word. The ink had already faded in her mind, but the meaning burned brighter. She knew Henry had not read it. She could feel it in the emptiness that had followed. If he had read it, there would have been silence, a deeper, more dangerous silence, the kind that comes from guilt. Instead, there was nothing. She wondered if he slept easily beside Jane Seymour now. If his dreams were clean, she wondered if Elizabeth still slept with her thumb curled against her cheek, as she had as a baby. She wondered if God still listened to queens, or if he only heard kings. The tower clock struck midnight. She whispered into the darkness, "If my daughter remembers me, let it be, not as a queen, but as a woman who loved her beyond all reason." The following morning, Kingston entered her chamber, carrying a parchment sealed with crimson wax. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "the verdict has been delivered." She looked at him with calm eyes, and the sentence, he hesitated. "You are to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure." Anne nodded slowly. "His pleasure," she repeated. "It seems he has always been ruled by that." Kingston bowed his head, but she smiled faintly. "Do not grieve for me. Good sir, death comes to all, but few meet it with their conscience whole." When he left, she crossed to the small mirror on the wall, a gift once sent to her from France, rimmed with silver. The glass was cracked, splitting her reflection into two faces. She studied them both, the woman who had been queen and the one who waited to die. They looked at each other as strangers, divided by only a heartbeat and the cruelty of a man's will. She whispered, "If this is the end, Let it be clean. Let me leave the world without bitterness. And then she prayed not for herself, but for Henry. It was not forgiveness. It was farewell. She prayed that he would see the truth in the child they had made together. That Elizabeth's eyes might one day remind him of the woman he destroyed. Outside, the ravens circled the tower walls, their wings heavy with mist. The carpenters had returned, hammering the scaffold into place. The sound echoed through the corridors like a drumbeat. Anne sat down by the window and folded her hands. The fog over the Thames began to lift, revealing the city beyond London alive and indifferent, preparing for another day. Somewhere out there, bells rang for Mass. Somewhere, people laughed, traded, gossiped, and in the heart of that same city, a queen waited for death with the dignity of someone who had already faced the worst of human betrayal. The trial was over, the letter unread, the sentence passed, but history was not finished with her yet. For in the days that followed, as she prepared for the scaffold, Anne Boleyn would transform her death into something no king could ever erase, an act not of submission, but of meaning. And through the silence of the tower, her last words were already forming words that would echo not only through the stones of London, but through centuries of England's memory. The Tower of London had many rooms for the condemned, but only one for a queen. It stood at the top of a narrow staircase, beneath the same roof where Anne Boleyn had once laughed with her ladies before her coronation. Now, the walls that had heard her joy held only the whisper of her prayers. Each morning, the pale light crept through the slit of the window, touching her face like a final blessing. She welcomed it as she might a priest at her bedside. She no longer counted the days. The passage of time had lost meaning. The sound of carpenters outside told her enough the scaffold was nearly finished. Every hammer strike was a heartbeat. Steady, patient, inescapable. Kingston tried not to meet her eyes when he entered the chamber, as though shame itself were contagious. "I am told," she said to him one morning, "that the king shows mercy, His Majesty." Kingston answered softly, "Has chosen the sword from Calais." Anne smiled faintly. "Then I am to die like a French woman." "Yes, Your Grace, better that than the fire," she said. "God has been kinder than man." In those final days, her body betrayed no fear, yet her heart trembled beneath the calm. She felt it when she prayed, when she brushed her hair, when she touched the cross that hung at her neck. It was not death itself that haunted her. It was the thought of being forgotten. Every queen before her had left a legacy written by men. Catherine of Aragon, remembered for her piety. Jane Seymour, remembered for her obedience. But who would write Anne's name without poison on the pen? She began to speak to her ladies more often now, as if dictating her own memory to those who would survive her. "When they speak of me," she told them, "let them say, I was not unkind. Let them say, I loved my king. Let them say, I died believing in my daughter." One of her attendants, Margaret Wyatt, could not hold back her tears. "They will remember, my lady. England will remember." Anne turned toward her, eyes sharp and kind. "England remembers what it is told to remember. That is why I must speak clearly before they silence me." She spent her hours writing not letters but fragments, prayers. Verses from the Psalms. Small notes of forgiveness. She spoke aloud as she wrote, her voice gentle, unhurried. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. She wrote another line beneath it. I forgive those who have sworn falsely against me. When she finished, she folded the scrap of paper and pressed it between the pages of her book of hours. That small book had followed her since girlhood, through the courts of France and England, through her marriage, through the Tower. On the first page, she had once written, Le temps viendra, the time will come. Now, she traced the faded words and whispered, it has. The Tower was not kind to the senses. The air was damp, smelling of iron and old prayers. The nights were alive with the groan of wood and the drip of unseen water. But within that stillness, Anne found something almost holy, a silence that no longer belonged to the world of men. She began to imagine what death might feel like, not the pain, but the release. She thought of her mother, long dead, waiting somewhere beyond the veil. She thought of Elizabeth's small hands, of the sound of her laughter. She thought of Henry, not the tyrant she now faced, but the man who had once written her poems in French, who had called her the only mistress of my heart. That man had died long before she would. What remained was a king haunted by the ghost of his own power. The day before the execution, the Archbishop of Canterbury sent a priest to her cell. He offered to hear her confession. Anne listened quietly, then said, I have nothing to confess, but my faith. He hesitated. And your sins? Madam, she smiled. My greatest sin is that I loved where I should have feared. The priest lowered his head. Do you forgive His Majesty? Anne looked toward the window. The light was fading now, the sky bruised with dusk. I forgive him, she said, for I would not die in anger. Let him live with what he has done. Als night fell, the tower grew colder. Her ladies prepared her bed, but she did not lie down. She wished instead to spend the night awake, to meet her death. As one greets a long-expected guest, she asked them to sing softly, and they did old songs from their girlhoods, melodies that drifted through the stone like smoke. At midnight, Anne spoke for the first time in hours. Do not think me sorrowful. I am ready. When dawn came, the sound of footsteps stirred the corridor. Kingston entered, pale and trembling. Your Grace, he said, the hour has come. Anne rose at once. She took his arm gently, as if comforting him. Be not afraid. Master Kingston, I have long been prepared. The morning of the 19th day of May was clear and sharp, the kind of day when the Thames gleamed like a blade. A scaffold draped in black had been raised within the Tower grounds. Surrounded by guards and curious witnesses, Anne stepped into the light with her head high. Her gown was gray satin, her cloak ermine trimmed. Around her neck hung a small gold cross. She looked neither to left nor right as she walked, her step steady, her face serene. When she reached the platform, she turned to the crowd. The silence was vast. Then she spoke, Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to the law. For by the law I am judged to die. I will say nothing against it. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince there never was. Her words were careful, practiced. She knew that even now, defiance would be twisted into heresy. Yet, beneath the submission, there was something else, a final irony. Subtle as the smile on her lips, she knelt upon the straw. Her ladies wept silently behind her. Anne reached up, removed her headdress, and tucked her hair beneath a white cap. Her lips moved, but no sound came, only prayer. The swordsman from Calais stepped forward. He had promised her mercy, and she believed him. "Is my body in the way?" she asked quietly. "No." "Madam," she whispered, "Lord Jesus, receive my soul." And with a single stroke, it was done. For a moment, no one moved. The crowd seemed suspended between breath and silence. Then the wind carried a sigh across the scaffold, and the spell broke. Her ladies rushed forward, gathering her body, wrapping it in white linen. They carried her to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was buried without name or monument, the earth closing over her like a secret. The king celebrated that evening at Hampton Court, but in the Tower, the silence did not end. Kingston wrote later that the air itself seemed changed after her death, as if the Tower had taken something from her and could not give it back. Some claimed they heard soft footsteps in the corridors, or the faint sound of a woman's voice reciting a prayer in French. Others said the ravens refused to leave the scaffold until nightfall, and somewhere beyond the city, in a quiet room at Hatfield, a little girl with red hair woke crying. Though no one knew why, Anne Boleyn's body was gone. But her letter, the one Henry never read, remained. It lay sealed in Cromwell's papers, silent but alive, like an ember hidden beneath ash. And in that silence, her true victory waited to rise. The day after the execution, the Tower fell into the kind of silence that feels unnatural, as though even the ravens had been frightened into stillness. The scaffold, still damp with rain and blood, was taken apart plank by plank before the city could wake. The straw was burned, the stain scrubbed away. Henry had ordered that nothing of her remain, no relics, no memories, no trace of her name in the stones. Within the palace, her rooms were emptied with swift, mechanical cruelty. Her gowns were divided among the ladies of the new queen, to be her jewels locked in chests for Jane Seymour. Even her emblems, the falcon crowned upon a branch of roses, were scraped from the walls. The king's will was swift. His conscience keyed her now. He had killed not a wife. He told himself, but a curse. But truth does not die so easily. Truth lingers in the places power cannot see, in the corners of letters, in the margins of books, in the voices of those who whisper long after the torches have gone out. Among the piles of confiscated papers in Cromwell's study lay the letter, Anne's letter, still sealed in crimson wax. The imprint of her ring pressed faintly into its surface. He could have destroyed it that day, tossed it into the fire with the rest of her writings, but he did not. Perhaps even Cromwell, a man carved from strategy, felt the weight of those folded words. Perhaps he feared them. He locked the letter away in his private archive. Among documents of far less danger, but far greater hypocrisy, confessions, treaties, payments for silence. And there it would remain for 4 long years. In the years that followed, England changed again. Jane Seymour married the king barely 2 weeks after Anne's death. She bore him a son, Edward, and died within days of childbirth. The court, always hungry for spectacle, called her the true queen, the pure one, the savior of the realm. But even as Henry buried her with royal honors, his nightmares returned Anne's eyes. The last he had seen before the sword fell. Unblinking, forgiving, he ordered every reminder of her erased again. Yet the more he tried to forget her, the more she lingered in his chapel. The hymn she had once favored was still sung by habit. In his dreams, she was never silent. He woke often, calling for confession. Then falling back into restless sleep, Cromwell, meanwhile, rose higher than ever. The king made him Earl of Essex, gave him estates, honors, and power unmatched by any man in England. But power built upon silence is fragile, and Anne's silence was not the kind that stayed buried. In the summer of 1540, 4 years after the execution, Henry turned his wrath upon Cromwell himself. The man who had destroyed a queen now stood accused of treason, heresy, and ambition, the same charges he had used against her as he awaited his own death. Guards ransacked his chambers. There, hidden in a wooden chest beneath financial ledgers, they found the letter. The seal was still intact, the parchment yellowed with age, but untouched. The words Anne had written in the Tower, words meant for a husband's heart, had become a ghost rising from the past. When the paper was unrolled, those present felt a strange unease. It was as if the dead queen had spoken across the years, reminding them that England's justice was merely the echo of its sins. Let not any light fancy or bad counsel of mine, enemies, withdraw your princely favor from me. Neither let that unworthy stain of a disloyal heart ever cast so foul a blot on your most dutiful wife and the infant princess, your daughter. The line shimmered faintly in the candlelight, even faded. The ink held its pulse. Historians would later say that Henry never saw the letter, but that is not certain. Some claimed he did that one of Cromwell's clerks, before the execution, had carried it to him in secret, that the king had broken the seal, read it in silence, and thrown it into the fire. But others whispered that he had not burned it, that he had hidden it. Unwilling to face the truth of it, the softness of it, the love buried inside its restraint, whichever version is true, the letter survived the fire that consumed everything else. And that survival, accidental or divine, became Anne's final triumph. Decades later, the parchment would be catalogued among the cotton manuscripts in the British Library. Its edges torn, its words smudged but legible. Scholars would debate its authenticity. Some said it was too perfect, too polished, the fantasy of later admirers who wished to paint her innocent. But those who understood the rhythm of her speech, the way her mind worked, like music and chess combined, I knew it was hers. There are moments in history when a woman's words outlived the men who condemned her. Anne's letter is one of them. Its final line reads, "Not like resignation, but like prophecy. From my doleful prison in the Tower, this 6th day of May, your most loyal and ever faithful wife, Anne Boleyn." She signed her name not as prisoner, not as traitor, but as wife. That word wife was her rebellion. It was her proof that the world could twist her reputation, but never her truth. In time, Elizabeth would come to understand what her mother had done. The child who had once been called illegitimate grew into a woman whose intelligence outshone every man at her court. When she ascended the throne, she ruled with the same measured poise that Anne had shown in the Tower, her silences calculated, her temper restrained, her words sharpened like blades. Elizabeth carried her mother's legacy, not in name, but in symbol. The pendant with the letter A, worn openly in her portraits, the ring with the hidden portraits, her own face beside Anne's. The refusal to marry, the insistence on ruling alone, the quiet vengeance of becoming everything her father had once doubted a woman could be. Each gesture was a reply to the letter Henry had never read. In the later years of her reign, Elizabeth kept the checkers ring close. Those who saw it said she touched it often, twisting it between her fingers when lost in thought. Inside the ring, behind a diamond lid, were 2 miniature faces, one unmistakably hers, the other a woman in a French hood. Some courtiers whispered that it was the Virgin Mary, others said it was Anne. But the Queen never answered. She did not need to. In her speeches, she would sometimes speak of the woman who gave me life. It was the closest she ever came to naming her. When she died in 1603, the ring was found still on her hand. The portraits inside were worn from decades of touch, but still visible. A mother and daughter staring out of eternity. Together at last. Anne Boleyn's letter had been written in despair, but it endured as defiance. It was a testament that even within the machinery of monarchy, where women's names were written only to be erased, a single page of truth could outlive an empire's lies. She had begged for justice, received none. She had prayed for mercy, found none. But she had written, and that act, so simple, so human, proved stronger than any throne. The king who ordered her death was remembered for cruelty. The daughter she protected was remembered for greatness. But the woman between them, the woman whose voice still trembles across the centuries from a faded page, she was remembered for something rarer, still courage made of words. And so the letter survived the fire. Years passed, and the name Anne Boleyn became a forbidden word, a ghost. The court pretended not to know. Her portraits were taken down, her emblems erased from stone, her initials struck from tapestries, yet her shadow lived quietly in the corners of palaces, in whispers carried by servants, in the way courtiers hesitated before speaking of the past. Henry moved on, but his court never truly forgot. The Tower had swallowed her body, but not her story. At Hatfield House, the little girl she had died for was growing red-haired, quick-minded, a child of both fire and caution. Elizabeth learned early that her mother's name could not be spoken. Her governess warned her gently, "Ask not about the queen your father loved. Yet silence has a way of feeding curiosity. When Elizabeth was old enough to read, she began searching for Trace's old letters, books, small things left behind by hands she never knew. Among her belongings was a simple gold pendant, engraved with the letter A. No one dared tell her whose it had been, but she wore it always. As she grew, she began to understand what had happened. Whispers reached her even in childhood, the story of the mother who had been condemned for sins she did not commit. In those whispers, Anne was many things: a witch, a saint, a séductrice, and a reformer. Elizabeth decided she would be none of them. She would be all of them. When Henry died in the year 1547, his body heavy with regret and sickness, he left behind a kingdom fractured, a son too young, a church without an anchor, a people still haunted by the ghosts of queens. Elizabeth was 13. She attended his funeral in silence, her face a mask of obedience. Beneath that mask, something ancient and unbreakable stirred the same steel her mother had carried to the scaffold. She watched Edward crowned, and later Mary. She watched her brother's reign vanish in sickness, her sister's reign drown in fire. She learned from both. She learned that kings could die, but words endured. She learned that survival was not won by love or faith, but by silence sharpened into strategy. In her private moments, she returned often to her mother's memory. She kept the Book of Hours that had once belonged to Anne, the same book found years later, with a faint inscription written in French: "Remember me when you do pray." That hope doth lead from day to day. The handwriting was small, delicate, defiant. Elizabeth would open that page at night and trace the faded ink with her finger. The gesture was ritual, not of mourning, but of connection. Her mother had died asking to be remembered. The daughter lived to ensure she never would be forgotten again. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, the air of England seemed to shift. She entered London on horseback beneath arches of flowers, the people shouting her name, and for the first time since Anne's death, the sound of joy returned to the city. Yet beneath the cheers lay something more profound. Many who looked upon her saw not only a new monarch, but the resurrection of an old one. She carried her mother's eyes, her poise, her smile that never revealed its thoughts. She ruled with Anne's elegance and with Henry's iron. In her first years as queen, Elizabeth surrounded herself with symbols her mother had once loved. She restored old jewels, revived fashions long forbidden, commissioned portraits that mirrored Anne's features: the long neck, the French hood, the sharp intelligence in the gaze. But she never said her mother's name, not once. It was her silence that spoke. Every choice she made as queen was a conversation with the ghost who had written that letter. Anne had died defending Elizabeth's legitimacy. Elizabeth lived proving it. There were times when she dreamed of the Tower. Those who served her said the queen often walked her chambers at night, restless, eyes distant. Perhaps she saw those same gray walls in her mind, not as a prison, but as inheritance. She had been born in a house of betrayal. She turned it into a kingdom of endurance. When ambassadors asked her about her parents, she answered lightly, "I thank God I am my father's daughter." But sometimes, when she was alone with her ladies, Her tone would change. "I may have my father's body," she once said, "but I have my mother's heart." That heart guided her every decision. When the bishops of Rome cursed her name, she stood firm. When suitors pressed for her hand, she refused them all. She would not be owned, not even by love. In this too, she was Anne's daughter, a woman who chose her own peril rather than live beneath another's rule. The court poets began to whisper that the queen wore a hidden ring, a jewel, unlike any other, set with a diamond that opened to reveal two faces inside. One was Elizabeth's, the other, a woman in a French hood. The legend was true. The checkers ring, as it would later be known, was her private relic, her mother's memory hidden beneath her crown. She never removed it. She wore it through wars and triumphs, through plague and victory, through 45 years of reign. When she held audiences, some noticed how she would turn the ring on her finger when the council spoke of faith or treason. It was as though she sought silent counsel from the woman who had died for both. Anne Boleyn had fought for her daughter's right to exist. Elizabeth ruled for her mother's right to be remembered. Sometimes, when she stood in her chapel, Elizabeth would glance at the crucifix and see not the suffering of Christ, but the calm face of another martyr, one with dark eyes, thin lips, and a voice that still lingered in history's silence. She did not weep. Queens could not afford to, but she carried the ache within her, the way others carried breath. As she aged, her hair turning to pale gold, her face lined with the labor of power, she began to speak more often of her childhood. She told her ladies how she once played in the gardens of Hatfield, how she had sat by the window and prayed for the mother she could not remember. One of them, curious, asked her what she imagined that mother to be like. Elizabeth smiled, a small, weary smile that seemed to stretch across decades. "Like myself," she said, "only braver." When she died in 1603, the ring still rested on her hand. They found it when preparing her body, the diamond clasp slightly worn from years of turning. Inside, the two faces stared up together. The mother who died for love, and the daughter who lived for it. The letter Anne had written, hidden and forgotten for generations, was brought to light once more. Its words, once whispered in the tower, now echoed in palaces. "Your most loyal and ever faithful wife." That signature, that refusal to be erased, had outlived the flames, the swords, the lies. History would try to divide them, one sainted, one feared, but in truth, they were one voice across time. Anne had written the letter that changed nothing in her life. Elizabeth lived the life that changed everything her letter had promised. The tower had been meant to bury a woman. Instead, it had birthed a legend, and in the quiet halls of memory, the quill still scratches, the candle still burns, and the letter still waits not as plea, but as proof that words, once born in truth, can never truly die. History forgets loudly, but it remembers in whispers. When the reign of Elizabeth reached its height, when England's ships ruled the seas and poets called her Gloriana, there was still one name that dared not be spoken in her presence, Anne Boleyn. Yet her face appeared everywhere, not openly, not by name, but beneath the surface of things, hidden inside the art. The jewels, the quiet corners of power, her spirit lingered like a candle flame behind glass. It began with the portraits. Elizabeth's painters were instructed to show her eternal, ageless, untouched by time. But the eyes were not Henry's, they were Anne's. Long, intelligent, edged with melancholy. Even when artists softened her features, they could not erase that unmistakable gaze, a mind that saw too much and spoke too little. One portrait, now known as NPG 200, became the most mysterious of all, painted in the latter years of Elizabeth's reign. It showed a noblewoman in a French hood, her face serene, hair expression unreadable. The sitter's name was lost, her story unknown. For centuries, no one suspected the truth until modern X-rays revealed another image beneath the paint, a woman wearing a hood from an older time, her features faint but recognizable. The same sharp chin, the same proud neck. Anne Boleyn had been there all along, hiding beneath her daughter's likeness. Buried in layers of oil and secrecy, at court, such discoveries were never spoken of. The Queen herself never acknowledged the resemblance, but sometimes, in council, when the lords argued or the ambassadors flattered, she would lift her chin in a way that silenced them all, a gesture remembered from another woman, another reign. Those who had known Henry in his youth would glance at one another, uneasy, for in that small motion, they saw not the daughter, but the wife he had destroyed. Elizabeth never explained her devotion to those memories. She didn't need to. Her entire reign was her mother's defense written in the language of power. She reformed the church as Anne had dreamed of faith in English, not Latin, built on thought rather than obedience. She governed with restraint, where her father had ruled by rage, and unlike Henry, she refused to let any man command her. Each of these acts was an answer to a ghost. There were nights when the Queen could not sleep. Those closest to her said she would dismiss her ladies and sit alone by the fire, the light flickering over her rings. The checkers ring always gleamed brightest, a small diamond chamber holding two faces. One was her own, painted in youth. The other, a woman in the French hood of a bygone age. She would twist the ring between her fingers, her eyes fixed on the flames. No one dared interrupt. Perhaps she was remembering the woman she had never known. Or perhaps she was speaking to her across years, across death, across the silence that had been forced between them. Once, when asked why she wore no crown in private, Elizabeth answered quietly, "Because it is heavy with ghosts." In the final decade of her rule, the line between memory and haunting began to blur. The Queen's beauty, once legendary, had begun to fade. Her skin grew pale as wax. Her teeth weakened. Her hair turned thin and brittle. To preserve the image of Gloriana, her attendants painted her face with white lead, layer upon layer, until her reflection was a mask. But behind that mask, the eyes were still Anne's fierce, restless, searching. Some nights, when she walked through the galleries of Whitehall, she would pause before the paintings. The faces of her ancestors stared down kings, conquerors, saints. And then her gaze would find the one that mattered most, the faint, nearly erased portrait of Anne Boleyn that had survived Henry's purge. The paint was cracked, the frame plain, yet she would stand before it for long moments. Her expression unreadable. Once, a courtier found her there and dared to speak, "Your Majesty, the hour is late." Elizabeth did not turn. "So was my mother's mercy," she said, and left the room. In time, the Queen grew to embody both of them, Henry's authority and Anne's wit, his pride and her passion, his violence and her restraint. She was the proof that from ruin could come empire, from blood could rise brilliance. Yet she carried the price of it in her loneliness. She had inherited her father's crown, but not his heart, her mother's courage, but not her peace. When ambassadors from Spain called her the bastard queen, she only smiled and answered, "Yes, and England's mother," as age deepened its shadow upon her. Elizabeth began to prepare for the end. Her court whispered about her vanity, her temper, her refusal to name an heir. But those who understood history knew better. The Tudor line had been born in blood, sustained by betrayal, and crowned by silence. To speak of endings was to awaken the ghosts again. In her private chambers, she began dictating prayers to her secretary. Some were for her people, some for her soul. And one found much later among her papers was for the woman who gave me life. Grant her, O Lord. The rest denied her in this world. Let her name be remembered, not for her fall, but for what she bore into the light. Those were her words, her last gift to the mother who had been erased. In the spring of 1603, the Queen fell ill. Her courtiers begged her to rest, but she refused to lie in her bed. A lion does not belike a lamb, she told them. She sat on the floor instead, wrapped in her coronation robe. Her crown beside her, the ring was still on her finger. When death finally came, it was quiet, the kind of silence that feels more like surrender than loss. Her ladies wept, but those who had known her longest said she seemed almost at peace. Her body was taken to Westminster Abbey and buried beside her half-sister Mary, the child of the woman who had hated her mother most. And there, above their shared tomb, the stone inscription reads simply, "Partners in a kingdom, sisters in eternity." But history knows the truth that the daughter's reign was the mother's redemption. Years later, scholars opened the checkers ring and studied the miniature faces inside. They found traces of blue pigment on the second portrait, ultramarine, the color reserved for the Virgin Mary and for queens. Beneath the years of wear, Anne Boleyn's face still looked upward, serene, defiant. The light had not faded from her eyes. Elizabeth's final act, whether she meant it or not, had reunited them. Two women separated by a sword, joined forever in a ring. The letter Henry never read, the portrait he ordered destroyed. The child he tried to forget all had survived him. And so, when night falls over the tower and the wind moves through its corridors, the story begins again. A mother, writing by candlelight, a daughter ruling beneath her ghost, and a silence more powerful than any king's decree. Spring returned to England that year, soft and damp, The kind of season that carries the scent of rebirth, yet for the first time in nearly half a century, there was no queen upon the throne. The bells of Westminster rang not for triumph, but remembrance. Elizabeth Tudor, last of her line, was gone. Her coffin lay beneath the vaulted ceiling of the abbey she had built for glory and buried in peace. Courtiers whispered prayers for her soul. But the older ones, those who had served her since youth, knew she would not rest quietly, for in death, as in life, she belonged to history's unrest. The checkers ring had been removed from her finger before burial. When the jeweler pried open its hidden chamber, dust rose like breath from a grave. Inside, the two portraits, Elizabeth and Anne, remained locked in their eternal gaze. The daughter and the mother, queen and prisoner, each immortalized in a circle of gold. Too small to hold their story? The jeweler bowed his head. He could not have known that in his hands he held the entire story of the Tudor crown, built on a woman's silence and another woman's defiance. The tower where Anne had died stood unchanged. Rain polished its stones. Centuries passed through its halls. But her name still haunted the air. Guards spoke softly after dusk, unwilling to disturb the echoes that seemed to breathe between the walls. Some nights, a candle burned in the queen's chamber, where no hand had lit it. Others swore they heard the faint sound of a woman's step across the floorboards, light, deliberate, unhurried. Perhaps it was memory itself? Walking, 500 years had passed, and yet her story remained unfinished. Because Anne Boleyn was never simply the woman Henry destroyed. She was the idea he could never kill. He built his own legend through conquest and cruelty. But hers was written through endurance, the quiet revolution of survival through remembrance. For every accusation he made, she left a counterspell. Her words in that letter, her defiance on the scaffold, her daughter's reign, all were acts of resurrection. In the centuries that followed, historians fought over her legacy. Was she ambitious or innocent, saint or sinner? Each generation reshaped her face, painting her in the colors it needed. The scheming temptress of Victorian morality, the tragic heroine of modern feminism. But the truth is simpler and deeper. Anne Boleyn was human brilliant, flawed, alive, with the dangerous light of those who refuse to be quiet. She was what every age fears most, a woman who thinks and dares to speak. Her letter still lies in the British Library. The parchment brittle, the ink brown with age. Scholars must turn its pages carefully, for the fibers crumble at the edges. Yet when the words are read aloud, the air seems to tremble, as if recognizing the weight of their author's breath. Let not my enemy's counsel withdraw your favor from me. Neither let that stain of disloyalty fall upon your wife and your daughter. The plea that failed to save her life became the sentence that preserved her memory. Elizabeth's reign ended where Anne's had begun, in a kingdom doubting its faith but renewed in its identity. The church that had condemned the mother became the inheritance of the daughter. The palace that had imprisoned one became the court of the other's glory. The tower that had taken life now gave birth to legend. And so, the circle closed. The girl whose mother was erased became the queen who refused erasure. The letter Henry never read became the testament England could not forget. In a quiet gallery at Hever Castle, Anne's childhood home. Her portrait still hangs. The colors have faded, the varnish cracked, but her eyes remain alive, dark, steady, full of irony. Beneath it, a single candle burns, placed there by a visitor who will never know her name. Some stand before the painting and think of tragedy. Others see victory. But those who listen long enough hear something else: the sound of quill on parchment, the heartbeat of a woman refusing to vanish. There are no tears left in this story now. Only light, the light that shines through stained glass at Westminster, catching the dust of centuries, gilding the tomb where Elizabeth lies. The inscription reads, "Partners in a kingdom, sisters in eternity." But somewhere beyond the stone, another voice still lingers. The one history tried to silence. "I am your most loyal and ever faithful wife." That sentence, tender, proud, unyielding, was her final act of authorship. It rewrote the meaning of love, of power, of legacy. Because Anne Boleyn did not win through survival, she won through remembrance. Every woman who writes her own truth, every daughter who carries the fire of her mother's defiance, is part of the letter she left behind. The tower stands, the river moves, the crown changes hands, but the echo remains the whisper that outlived kings, the sound of ink, still drying, the sound of a heart, still speaking. Anne's voice, always Anne's.